Hello, listeners! Welcome to Stars of the Golden Age, a show that highlights the lives of legends from film, music, and the birth of television during Hollywood's golden age and the few years surrounding it. I am your host, Erin Carlson. Hey everyone! This episode was requested by listener Stacy L. This one's for you, Stacy. Thank you so much for your recommendation. Before I begin, if you are interested in some interesting bonus content, listen at the end for information on how to grab that. I have some really fun topics planned for future bonus episodes. This month is all about I Love Lucy, some fun behind-the-scenes info. And I do have a new patron that just joined the fun. Thank you so much to Rachel L. for joining the Patreon. If you want to join Rachel and the others over on Patreon, listen at the end to learn how you can get access to that bonus content. But first, let's talk about our star of the week. And man, is this story a wild ride. Today, we will be discussing the life of actor Robert Mitchum. Robert Charles Derman Mitchum was born on August 6, 1917 in Bridgeport, Connecticut, to parents Jimmy and Ann. He had an older sister named Annette who was 3 years old when he was born, and she had acting in her future as well. Jimmy Mitchum was a laborer in the shipyards and for the railroad, and Mother Annette took care of the home and family, and she had a huge love for books, music, and the arts. She was a very spiritual woman, very bohemian. She was a painter, a poet, and a self-taught musician of several instruments. She had dreamed of becoming an actress, but was never able to chase those dreams. It was her love of the performing arts that instilled an interest into the field into her children. Anne was a beautiful woman. Robert Mitchum got her eyes. Not long after little Robert was born, the family relocated from Connecticut to Charleston, South Carolina. Robert Mitchum told the story later in life that the relocation came after his father assaulted a man who was harassing his wife Anne. Maybe even killed the man. Stomped his brains out were the exact words used. So they fled town. It was there in Charleston, while working for the railroad, that tragedy struck. Tragedy always seems to strike in these stories, doesn't it? Well, in this case, it was pretty horrific. Jimmy Mitchum was involved in a terrible accident while at work in February of 1919. He was violently crushed between two train cars that he had just finished disconnecting. The injuries he sustained were gruesome. I'll spare you the details. Anne was able to get to the scene quickly and hold her husband's badly injured body in her arms as he took his last breaths. Jimmy was only 27 years old at the time of his death, leaving behind a young wife and 2 young children. Robert Mitchum was only 18 months old when his father died. To make this incident even more heartbreaking was the fact that 25-year-old Anne was pregnant with their 3rd child when her husband died. Very similar to Lucille Ball's story. Little John was born in early September, about 6.5 months after Jimmy died. Anne would now be solely responsible for the care and support of 3 young children, and she had no work experience. She received a government pension of $18 per month. That's only the equivalent of $332 today, so not enough to support a family. This was a very difficult situation for a young woman to be in during those days. It would be difficult today, but it was even worse then. She would usually have 2 choices: lean on family for help, or marry the first man who comes along so your children can have a roof over their heads and food on the table. Anne did both. She moved back to Connecticut where her family lived, and they were able to help her until option B occurred. The first man who came along. His name was Bill Clancy, and Anne didn't particularly like him, but he was able to support her and the children. Bill was an aggressive alcoholic. She was able to endure it for a little while, but it just became too much when his abuse escalated to destroying the house and almost killing her in one drunken rage. It wasn't worth it. When Anne's youngest child, little John, was old enough to go to school, she was finally able to go out to work. She worked in a photographer's shop and then as a linotype operator at a local newspaper, and then eventually a proofreader. It was at this job where she met someone new, a man named Hugh Morris who also worked at the paper. Robert was the most difficult one of Anne's 3 children, but he roped his little brother John into a lot of sticky situations too. It doesn't sound like he really meant to be difficult. Well, maybe not as difficult as he was. He was just a very curious and energetic child. Another common theme we see in our stories. Robert would exhibit a lot of mistaken behaviors. Things like pulling pranks at school, not cooperating with his teachers, running away from home, and getting into fights at school. There is one story from Bob's youth when he was 7 years old where he drug his little 5-year-old brother out to roam the town. Well, little John got hit by a car when they were crossing a busy street, and then his little body got thrown in front of a second car. He was knocked unconscious, and an ambulance was called by terrified bystanders. Meanwhile, Bob beelined it out of there and ran home. When his mother asked where his 5-year-old brother was, Robert replied, "Oh, he's been run over by 2 cars, but I don't think he's dead yet." Well, thankfully, he didn't die, but he was pretty severely injured. His jaw had to be reset, and he had a steel plate inserted in the back of his skull. Poor little guy. Although a bit mischievous at times, Robert was also very creative and artistic. He loved to read and write stories and poetry. In fact, his mother's new boyfriend's position at the Post was that of children's editor. So he published Robert's poems in the newspaper at a pretty young age. Robert also started his own newspaper publication as a child, which I can relate to because I did the very same thing when I was a kid. Although Hugh was helpful in nurturing Robert's love of writing, the two didn't really get along. Between this and his troubling behavioral issues, Anne decided to send Bob to live with family. Several members of her family resided together at a farm in Delaware, and she thought maybe a change of scenery would help her son. He was 12 years old, and his younger brother John went with him, while their older sister stayed in Connecticut with their mother. So, what do you think life was like for a 12-year-old boy and a 10-year-old boy on a farm in 1929? All fun and games? Of course not. They were the perfect age to do the most strenuous farm chores. The boys were forced out of bed at dawn each day to do their daily chores. Life was pretty primitive on the farm. Light came from oil lamps, their heat from a wood stove, their milk and butter came from their one dairy cow, their eggs from their chickens, water came from a hand pump outside, and their bathroom was a cold outhouse in the yard. It was a lot of work, every single day. Bob and John didn't love their new life in Delaware, but they really didn't have much of a say in it. Both boys were acting out even worse than they had when they were living with their mother. And it came to a boiling point when Robert left a number 2 in one of his teacher's hats and left it on his desk as a nice little after-school surprise. That was the last straw. Robert Mitchum was expelled. During the year and a half or so that Bob and John were living at the farm, their mother had married Hugh the newspaper man and had another child with him, a baby girl named Carol. Once Bob was expelled for pooping in his teacher's hat, it was bye-bye Delaware and back to their mother, whether she liked it or not. By this time, older sister Annette was a busy vaudeville performer. She was still a teenager, but that didn't seem to matter much to her mother. She loved that her daughter was pursuing performing arts, and the extra money didn't hurt either. In fact, teenage Annette housed her whole family in New York City in a tiny apartment for a while. Her mother, her 2 brothers, and her baby sister. And then stepdad Hugh lost his job at the newspaper, so he moved to the city with the crew too. It was really tight. Bob and John slept in the kitchen. Bob got a job as a soda jerk at the Astor Hotel on Broadway to help his family out. Bob enrolled in a new high school in New York as a freshman, and he got right back into trouble, less than impressing a new set of teachers. One early stunt at his new school was throwing a lit firecracker into some poor kid's tuba during a band concert. He and his brother John were still into fighting anyone who looked at them the wrong way, but they were in for a new kind of opponent on the streets of New York during the Great Depression. Still, they were both tough, very small-framed with toothpick arms, but they had the fight in them. Robert Mitchum was a very curious individual. He had an adventurous spirit, a little gypsy blood in him, his sister would say. He wasn't one to be content in one place, going through the motions of life day in and day out. He was incredibly intelligent, very well-read, and highly cultured from his frequent visits to New York museums. He wanted to see, to feel, to experience everything he could in life. So, in the first days of 1932, when he was 14 years old, he set out into the world on his own. "I guess my ambition was to be a bum," he later said. So that's what he did, for a while at least. He joined the growing community of hobos, as they were called then, who rode the rails to wherever the adventure would take them. During the Great Depression, so many people had begun hopping trains that little camps were being set up outside of rail yards. They were called hobo jungles. Robert Mitchum initially loved this new life of adventure, but then he realized it was sometimes very, very cold, and that he would often be very, very hungry. And then he realized it could be dangerous at times. On one particularly cold rail trip, Bob was using pieces of newspaper stuffed into his pant legs for insulation. Well, another vagabond had made a little fire right there in the train car to stay warm. A spark flew onto Bob's leg, which is usually no big deal. But when you have a bunch of newspapers stuffed down your pants, it is a pretty big deal. He immediately started on fire. The other guy was able to rip his pants off before his legs burned. I'm sure he was warm for a few seconds, but now he was left even colder because that was his only pair of pants. Once the train stopped, he had to walk through the freezing streets pantsless, looking for a clothesline he could steal some frozen pants from. Then there was, of course, the danger involved in the actual boarding and riding of the trains. I'm going to read a passage directly from Lee Server's book, Robert Mitchum, Baby, I Don't Care, which was my primary source, just to give you an idea of the dangers of the tracks. He wrote, quote, "You could easily be set on fire or have your eyes burned out by live cinders blowing back from the engine. The train might hit a steep downhill pass so fast that you could be tossed off like a rag doll. Or the freight you were sitting on in a gondola could shift suddenly and slide you out into space. Or sitting in an open boxcar with legs dangling out, the way many kids like to do, could leave you with your limbs ripped open by a signal post or crushed by a sudden entrance into a narrow tunnel. Many people, especially young ones, routinely fell under the wheels while trying to board a train or fell to their deaths moving between moving cars or walking a roof walk. If the train itself didn't kill or maim you, the employees of the railroad made a try at it." End quote. So this lifestyle was definitely an adventure, but usually not a very fun one. Bob learned a lot about life, humanity, and survival during his days in the hobo jungles. He learned how to use the sky as a compass, how to properly defend himself in fights, how to repair clothing, how to use what he had in creative ways, and how to kill his own food. Like squirrels. Poor little squirrels, I love those little buggers. 14-year-old Robert Mitchum was also already well on his way to a life of heavy drinking. Back on the farm, he'd been stealing his grandmother's fruit wines, and now living on the rails, he was passing around moonshine with other transients. And when moonshine wasn't available, they'd smoke weed, which was apparently growing everywhere. Back then, it was the poor man's whiskey, Bob said. Actually, Robert Mitchum became quite the marijuana connoisseur before too long. He not only enjoyed the way it felt better than alcohol, but he took the time to study the botanical properties and was able to distinguish different varieties from different regions. He could make a career out of that talent today, but back then, not so much. The community of transients helped each other in many ways. One way they would do this is by leaving signs and signals in different towns along the rails in order to communicate to others which houses were generous with food, money, or work handouts. They would leave coded marks on curbs with chalk or scratches in fence posts, both to tell the good houses and the ones to steer clear of. Robert Mitchum was often starving, so he was happy to take on small jobs while in towns in exchange for a little food. Sometimes he would stick around a while and take on a proper job. Some of these positions were digging ditches, picking fruit, or washing dishes. A few times he pleaded with local police to allow him to be locked up in a cell for a night, just so he could stay warm and get a decent night's sleep. Although there was a lot of camaraderie on the rails, there was also a lot of violence against one another. It wasn't uncommon for transients to rob each other, sometimes while they slept or sometimes after a violent attack. Many were looking out for one person and one person alone, themselves. They would do anything they had to survive this lifestyle. And of course, crimes and violence against hobos and transients weren't a top priority to the police, or a priority at all. Many men and boys went missing with nobody ever knowing what happened to them. Death could occur in this lifestyle without anyone knowing or caring. Suicide was a pretty common occurrence too. The worst almost did happen to 15-year-old Robert Mitchum, but not as a result of violence. He was arrested with a bunch of other boys in Savannah, Georgia for being a, quote, Yankee bum. He was locked up for 7 days, which doesn't sound too bad, especially for a homeless kid who was starving. But he wasn't in your run-of-the-mill jail cell. He was brought to a work camp outside of Savannah, which was located in a swampland where mosquitoes were huge and hungry. He was outfitted with a metal clamp around his ankle and then chained with a heavy chain to 4 other prisoners, a chain gang. Every day at dawn, the prisoners were hauled away for hard manual labor repairing roads. Bob didn't really mind the punishment, but the metal clamp around his ankle was fastened too tight and he developed a terrible wound from it, and it was beginning to become infected. The cops didn't care about sickness or injury. There were boys and men far more sick than Bob was, and they were still forced to work. Doctors were never called. So he decided to escape. Since the shackles were taken off for their manual labor, Bob ran away as soon as he was free. He was shot at twice as he ran like hell to freedom, but he got away safely. Well, except for his terribly infected leg. He knew he needed help. He hitchhiked from Georgia and slowly worked his way back up to his family in Delaware. By the time he arrived there, the doctor told Bob and his family that he would need to have his infected leg amputated immediately or he would surely die. Well, his mother wouldn't allow it, and she knew best. She went into the woods and collected all kinds of herbs and plant materials and made a natural antibiotic paste and applied it constantly for 2 days. And it worked. The infection cleared and Bob's leg was saved. Now that he was back in Delaware and staying in one place for a little while, 15-year-old Robert Mitchum was able to establish somewhat of a social life. And this included swooing away the girl his brother John had a crush on. When he met Dorothy Spence, he was in love. He'd never in his 15 short years felt the way about another person like he felt in the presence of Dorothy. She was it, he said, and that was that. I should point out that Dorothy was only 13 years old. These things usually require the other person to be interested too, and Dorothy Spence wasn't really interested in the scraggly-looking, tough-talking, scrawny-armed Robert Mitchum. But he continued to pursue her heavily, in a manner that would be very cringeworthy today. But in Bob's case, it worked. Dottie found his stalking behavior charming, and slowly he convinced her that he was a pretty interesting guy to be around. It took several months, but Dottie fell in teenage love with Robert Mitchum. Bob stuck around Delaware, but he didn't re-enroll in school, and it doesn't sound like anyone tried to force him to either. Instead, he went to work. In the summer of 1933, he joined the Civilian Conservation Corps and was paid $30 per month, or $736 per month today. This was tough physical labor, so it helped grow the toothpick-armed, malnourished 15-year-old boy into a broad, muscular man. Thank you, FDR. A couple of years down the road, I believe in the summer of 1935, Bob's entire extended family decided to get out of Delaware and move to sunny California. Sister Annette, who now went by Julie, was already living in Long Beach pursuing her acting career, so they all thought, why not? While the majority of them were planning on traveling together in a proper way, Bob and his brother decided to get a head start and hitchhike their way west. Bob promised Dottie he'd return for her, and off they went. It was a long, roundabout journey, and it included some pretty heavy drama. They hitched a ride with 3 men who stopped along the journey for a bunch of moonshine, and they ended up staying and partying with the guys for a few days before continuing on. Well, one drunken night, Bob and John were awoken to the sounds of gunfire. It turned out they were in the middle of a gunfight between their new pals and a rival bootleg gang. They barely made it out alive. After that fiasco, the boys decided to ride the rails the rest of the way to California. But that didn't mean it was smooth sailing. When a railroad officer had a gun to John's chest as he and Bob scrambled onto a departing freight car, he panicked and froze while the train left the station with Bob on it. John was hauled away, and Bob was headed for California alone. He made it, and John tried really hard to make it there too after he was released from jail. But he wasn't a pro-hobo like his brother. Bob did finally make it to California, and I don't think he ever rode the rails again. Robert Mitchum's primary job once he got to Long Beach was that of a beach bum. He took on a few odd jobs here and there, including working as a stagehand for the theater guild his sister worked with, but he just loved that unconventional, non-working lifestyle. Or at least not being tied down to a typical 9-to-5 type job. By the time he made his way back east to Dottie, she was a young woman out of her parents' home and working as a secretary. He wasn't ready to swoop her away yet, though. But that doesn't mean he didn't plan to someday. He wanted to be able to give her a good life. Not really sure how he planned to do that as a professional beach bum, but he envisioned wealth in his future somehow. He told her, "Stick with me, kid, and you'll be farting through silk." So romantic. Robert Mitchum first performed as an actor in the summer of 1937 when his sister pushed him into a production that her theater guild was doing, Rebound. Bob had a supporting role in the play, and his cool yet intelligent presence was very well received. He had no interest in being an actor, unlike everyone else in the theater world, so he wasn't overdoing it on stage. He was just very natural. Soon he was in leading roles in the guild, including the role of Duke Mantee in The Petrified Forest. Aside from this unplanned acting career he was building, Robert Mitchum was also still writing. He was very well read, could recite most of Shakespeare's words by heart, and he wrote beautiful poetry. And when his sister began performing in nightclubs as a singer and pianist, Bob wrote music lyrics for her. And before long, he was writing lyrics for other local musicians. It came incredibly easy to him, so it was a great way to make money. Robert Mitchum made his way back east once again in the spring of 1940, determined to make Dorothy his wife now. He wasn't rich by any means, but compared to the life he'd been living the last several years, he was very rich. It was good enough for him, and lucky for him, it was good enough for Dottie. 22-year-old Robert and 20-year-old Dorothy eloped on March 16, 1940, and immediately boarded a Greyhound bus for California, ecstatic for their new life together in the Golden State. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Well, guess where their first home was as husband and wife? A chicken coop in the backyard of Bob's family. They literally lived in a chicken coop. Don't worry, the chickens had all moved out. Once back in California, Mitchum continued to write and he continued to act in small theater productions. He was pretty content with this life working in show business. On the home front in the little chicken coop, Dorothy discovered she was pregnant just a few months after she and Bob were married. This grand California dream was not what she had envisioned on her honeymoon bus ride to her new life, and she was terrified to bring a child into this kind of life. So Bob went out and got a proper job, a sheet metal worker at the Lockheed aircraft plant. And he hated it. His family hated it too. You see, they were all a bit free-spirited and bohemian, and they knew a solid daily job was not what Bob was meant for. So they began to resent his new bride for pushing him into this wild lifestyle of going to work every day. Then, believe it or not, I know I didn't believe it, he received a doctor's note to quit his job. The stress from the job he hated had made him lose his eyesight, apparently. According to the doctor, there was nothing physically wrong with his eyes. He told him it was psychological, that his loss of sight was a result of exhaustion and stress. He wrote him a note to get out of his very needed wartime duties at Lockheed. Sounds a little weird to me, but that's the account I read. I have a very exhausting job, and I haven't lost any of my senses, not once. Bob quit his job, and within a couple days, he could see again. Then his mother Ann suggested he try getting cast in a movie since he had done so well in those small stage productions. So he secured an agent and gave it a shot. Meanwhile, Robert and Dorothy welcomed their first child into their chicken coop on May 8, 1941, a little boy named James. While waiting for his breakout role, Mitchum did some extra work and also worked as a shoe salesman to make ends meet. And then came his first part, a supporting role in 1943's Hoppy Serves a Wit and Border Patrol, both part of the Harry Sherman Productions Hopalong Cassidy Western series. He ended up cast in 7 Hopalong Cassidy films, plus tons of other small parts in mostly low-budget films. He was by no means a movie star, but he was definitely a steadily working screen actor. Even after he achieved fame, Mitchum considered the days doing the Hopalong B films the happiest of his film career. "I was very pleased to work on the Hoppies," he said. "Supper on the ground, free lunch, $100 a week, and all the horse manure you could carry home." Robert Mitchum got his first taste of real A-film style filmmaking when his agent secured a supporting role for him in MGM's The Human Comedy, starring Mickey Rooney, later in 1943. Dorothy and Bob also welcomed their second child on October 16th of that year, another son they named Christopher. And with their growing family, they decided it was time to move out of the chicken coop and into a proper house. Not a big house, but at least a house with its own bathroom. The house was just down the street from Bob's family's house. Dorothy was happy to get away from them, but in her opinion, it wasn't far enough. They were just so different, Dottie and the Mitchums. Bob's mother Ann and his sister Julie were constantly meddling in their lives and criticizing Dottie's straight-laced way of life. Not only that, but they were both pretty jealous of their little Bobby's wife, taking his attention away from them. So Dorothy was happy to be out of their backyard, but they were still popping over and getting into her business any chance they could. By the end of 1944, now 27-year-old Robert Mitchum was signed to a 7-year contract with RKO Pictures. He was now a steady movie actor receiving a nice regular paycheck. This was never his dream, but it was pretty nice the way things worked out for him. His starting salary was $350 per week, and he would receive steady raises with a max of $2,000 per week by his final 7th year of his contract. But, as was the norm in the old studio system, there were also strict rules, the studio could cut the contract at any time, and there was a detailed morals clause. And morals were never Robert Mitchum's strong suit. Although from the outside, it sounds like Bob met the woman he knew he was destined to spend eternity with when they were just kids. He married that woman. They were building a family and an American dream together, and everything was rosy and happy. We can't forget who Robert Mitchum really was. He was a tough street kid who loved to get into brawls any chance he could. He loved weed and booze in excess. He detested rules and social norms. And although he and Dottie had been together since they were teenagers, Bob was never completely loyal to her. And that didn't change once they were married and had children. Now that he was spending so much time on studio sets, he was surrounded by tons of beautiful young women, both actresses and hair, wardrobe, makeup artists, secretaries. He wasn't picky. He loved the ladies, and he didn't mind stepping out on his marriage in that way any chance he could. So all of these things combined may be a little issue for him when it comes to that morals clause. 7 years is a long time to be a good boy. And then came the incident of April 6th, 1945. The details are a little murky, but Robert Mitchum's account is that his wife and baby were both ill, so he went out to get a prescription for the baby. He called his home while out, and his sister Julie answered the phone at his house and refused to let him talk to his wife. He attempted to call several more times to no avail. When he arrived home, there were police officers waiting for him and accused him of threatening behavior to someone inside of the home, in his home. He had no idea what they were talking about, and his frustration spilled out into physical anger. He punched a cop, another cop clubbed him with a billy club, and more assault happened from there. Bob was arrested and sentenced to 6 months in jail. This wasn't good. So I'm not really sure what the motivating factors were that caused the women to call the police and refuse Bob's entry into the home, but it did sound like he was severely intoxicated during this event, so who knows. Either way, he was screwed if he had to be locked up for 6 months when he was fresh into his contract with RKO. This wasn't going to fly with the morals clause. An RKO attorney was able to negotiate an alternative to Robert Mitchum's jail sentence: military service. Bob had been spared from military duty during World War II so far because, okay, this doesn't make much sense to me either, but apparently because he had false teeth. I'm not really sure why that would exclude him from fighting in a world war, but that's just what I read in both of my source books. Anyways, he was officially enlisted in the military during World War II now, but he never left U.S. soil. Germany surrendered on May 7th, 1945, and the war was officially over on September 2nd, so he was only serving at the very tail end of the war. Later that year, Robert Mitchum was nominated for an Academy Award for his work in The Story of G.I. Joe. Shortly before the assault incident that landed him in the Army, Robert Mitchum had been lent out to Lester Cohen Productions to do this movie. It was released while he was still serving his patriotic sentence, and when he got out, he was suddenly a heartthrob to the ladies. He was receiving tons of fan mail from young women, and they had things to say about him to gossip reporters, too. As published in Photoplay, one young woman was quoted as saying, "He's got sex appeal in an evil sort of way." And another said, "He has the most immoral face I have ever seen." Robert Mitchum definitely had a very unique look. I remember the first time I saw him was in Holiday Affair with Janet Leigh when I was a kid, and thinking he was a really cool, good-looking man in a very non-classical way. Even when RKO was toying around with the idea of signing him, half of the execs thought his unique look was good, and half thought he was horrific looking. I don't know, I really dig it. And apparently the young women of the mid-1940s dug it too. The first Robert Mitchum fan club members were called the Mitchum Drulettes.
They vanish into the shadows, they slip through the cracks, and sometimes they were never meant to be caught. I'm AC Roberts, and every week on Wanted, we investigate the killers who got away, both identified and unknown. Some are cold cases frozen in time, while others remain terrifyingly active. We break down the facts, the theories, and the disturbing unanswered questions that keep these cases alive. Who killed Joseph Elwell in a locked room? How did Charles Rogers disappear after the gruesome Icebox murders? And could the truth about the Sodder children still be out there? Check out our website, thewantedpodcast.com, to find us on your favorite platform, or follow us on Instagram @thewantedpodcast for updates and case discussions. Because justice may be blind, but the past is never truly buried.
So, as I like to do, I'm going to be skimming over most of Robert Mitchum's career and focus more on his personal life. I'm here to talk about the people themselves, not so much their career stats, because human nature is way more interesting, don't you think? As far as what people who worked with Robert Mitchum observed, he was definitely a unique individual. It was said that he was constantly drunk and high, but regardless, he would walk on set and perfectly deliver his lines. Again, probably because he just didn't care too much. He was just being himself. Another thing that was mentioned by many people who worked with him was how surprised they were to learn how intelligent he was. because from the outside, he just appeared like a guy who grew up uncultured and was just really tough and really simple. But when people got to know him, they realized what an articulate and cultured man he really was. RKO wanted to capitalize on the appeal Robert Mitchum had on young American women, so they began pushing him into public appearances, interviews, and social outings. But he refused to be their puppet. He didn't really care what the repercussions were. He wasn't going to do anything he didn't want to do. So this bad boy behavior was then spun by reporters as free-thinking, rugged, independent, brilliant, and non-conforming, which made his appeal even greater. Robert Mitchum was a huge movie star now, but he did not live like a movie star. He lived a typical home life in a typical home. No big mansion, no hired help, no big fancy material things. And he didn't run around town with other movie stars. He still hung out with the friends he had before fame and just lived his life the way he wanted to live it. Here's an example of him doing what he wanted to when he wanted to do it. While on loan to MGM for the movie Undercurrent, he and his stand-in, Tyrone Cabine, became bestie drinking buddies, and they would go out carousing together any free moment they had. Booze, weed, trouble, and women. They loved it. Well, one night after hours of bar hopping, they cruised onto the MGM lot past a barely awake guard and raided the makeup and costume department. They stole towels, hair dryers, an eyelash curler, a shaver, 25 hairbrushes, and even one of Lucille Ball's wigs. They thought these things would be wonderful gifts for their girlfriends and Bob's wife Dottie. Unfortunately, these two drunkos had been spotted by witnesses on the MGM lot. Poor Dorothy was just picking up her shiny new professional hairdryer to dry her hair the next morning when the studio police came knocking on the Mitchum door. All of the fun new stuff was taken back to MGM, but Robert Mitchum was star enough that this offense was swept under the rug. Lucky break. Dorothy really wanted to move out of their tiny home and far outside of the neighborhood of her pesky bohemian in-laws. Bob would have been happy still living in the chicken coop, but he appeased his wife by purchasing a 4-bedroom home. I looked up the home on Oak Glen Drive, and it wasn't large by any means, actually only 1,600 square feet, which seems really small for 4 bedrooms. It was built in 1938, and they paid $12,500 for it in 1946. The current estimate of the home is $1.6 million. LA real estate. Dorothy was much happier in their new home, but she wasn't super happy in her marriage. Bob was gone all the time, off bar hopping constantly, and cheating on her any opportunity he could. On a trip back east to visit family in the summer of 1948, Dorothy decided to stay with her family and not return to LA with her husband. She wasn't sure if she wanted to get a divorce or not, but she did know that she was extremely unhappy in her marriage. To make matters worse, Robert Mitchum wasn't awesome with money. Well, he was awesome at spending it at local watering holes and loaning out large sums of it to friends and never being repaid. So he took on a business manager to help him save his earnings. But he chose the wrong man, because this man stole everything from him and left the Mitchums with nothing. The business manager ended up going to jail in 1949, and it was a hard lesson in trust for Robert Mitchum. While Dorothy and the kids were still away and Bob was giving her promises of improving his lifestyle and creating a happier future for them, he got in a little more trouble with the law. He had been seeing actress Lila Leeds for a few weeks. I know, not a great way to work on your marriage. And he and a friend had gone over to her house to smoke weed on the night of September 1st, 1948. The police had their eyes on both Mitchum and Lila Leeds, since they were both widely known pot smokers. And unfortunately, 2 police officers were waiting in the bushes outside of Lila's home that night when Bob and his friend arrived to hang out with Lila and her friend. The cops observed the foursome through the windows and then let themselves in the back door of the bungalow, ready to ruin everyone's night and possibly ruin their lives. All 4 of them were arrested and charged with narcotics possession, a felony with a sentence of up to 6 years. This was bad, really bad in 1948. During booking, when Robert Mitchum was asked his profession, he replied, "Former actor." and he very likely could have been correct with that witty remark. Many a Hollywood crime and scandal was covered up by the famous fixers whose job it was to keep the stars' images clean and shiny. But that wouldn't be possible for Robert Mitchum and Lila Leeds. Reporters were tipped off of the arrest before they even arrived to the police station, tipped off by the LAPD themselves. They were going to send a message with these arrests. There was no fixing this one. They would still try, though. Studio lawyers bailed Mitchum out the following morning and advised him to tell any reporters that he was innocent and that he was framed. Which is funny because he was literally holding a joint when the cops busted in. Unfortunately, the LAPD was happy to share any and all information about this drug arrest with the press. They were out for blood in Hollywood social circles, determined to lock up anyone who touched marijuana, and eventually get to the source and put the dealers away for a long, long time. To rid the county of its terrors, as they put it. The LAPD reported that they had been tailing Robert Mitchum for months. They had been following him everywhere he went, waiting for that moment they could catch him in the act of smoking pot. They just happened to be watching Lila Leeds that fateful night when they hit the lottery the moment Robert Mitchum drove up, entered the bungalow, and immediately lit up. When David O. Selznick was asked about the situation by gossip columnist Luella Parsons, he responded that Mitchum was sick and should immediately be admitted to a sanitarium to heal his, quote, shattered nerves. I mean, that's what the weed is for, isn't it? Parsons wrote in her column the day after the arrest, quote, he could still be cured, providing he wanted to be. Other addicts have been successfully treated, and certainly this 31-year-old actor, who is at the peak of his fame, should realize it is up to him to get himself on his feet, end quote. Other publications the day after the arrest included headlines like, Mitchum sick, and I'm ruined, says Mitchum after marijuana arrest, and Mitchum holds hobo instinct. It's so funny to read these accounts of marijuana use from the past, when here we are today, hardly able to take 10 steps down any given street without smelling weed, and having THC products on sale at basically every store you walk into. Robert Mitchum would have loved 2025. Well, this fiasco was the driving force that finally pushed Dorothy and the children back home with Bob. The studio heads convinced her to return home in order to portray a united home front and a happy family picture while they tried to rebuild Bob's public image. She was not happy about it, but she returned home with the children. As preparations were being made for the narcotics trial, RKO was doing everything they could to salvage Robert Mitchum's career. Howard Hughes had just taken over RKO, and lucky for Robert Mitchum, he was a huge Robert Mitchum fan. So he was going to do anything he could to rebuild his career and reputation. Robert Mitchum was sentenced to 1 year in the county jail, which was then suspended, and then placed on 2 years of probation, with 60 days of it to be served in the county jail. After a couple of days there, he was transported to the Wayside Honor Farm, 40 miles north of LA, to finish out his sentence. The work of RKO's lawyers. Robert Mitchum was released from custody on March 30th, 1948. His statement to awaiting reporters was this, quote, I've been happy in jail. Nobody envied me. Nobody wanted anything from me. I did my work and they let me alone. I'm through with my so-called pals. I'll see only my wife, my 2 children, and a couple of close friends. Parties? I'd stand out like a monster at a party. I'm typed, a character, and I guess I'll have to bear that the rest of my life, end quote. 3 years later, after his sentence and probation period were all completed, the verdict was overturned and taken off his record. Robert Mitchum walked away from this experience pretty unscathed. With Howard Hughes and RKO completely having his back, his career resumed and his popularity continued to rise. He jumped right back into his film noir roles that he was so popular with, along with a few westerns. He was cast in Holiday Affair during the Christmas season of 1949 as a way to brighten up his dark image. He was lucky being able to salvage his career like this. Lila Leeds, unfortunately, wasn't so lucky. I want to share a quote from Janet Leigh, Mitchum's young co-star in Holiday Affair, because she really sums up Robert Mitchum in a nutshell with her statement. She said, Quote, I was pretty naive and green back then, and the fact that he had been in jail and that he had actually smoked marijuana, wow, this sounded really exciting and dangerous. When we did start to work together, I found him to be the most delicious person in the world. An extremely good actor, as everybody knows now, but he was so easy and cool. He never looked like he was acting. He was actually very intense and focused on what he was doing, but you were never aware of it. And working with him, he brought out that quality in you, which was great. I learned a lot from him. But he was such a tease, and I was so gullible and such an easy target, end quote. Bob and Dorothy upgraded to yet another new home for their family, a home in Malibu Canyon. It was much larger than their previous home. It was private, it had a sprawling yard, a pool, and best of all, for Dorothy at least, it was far away from trouble. Howard Hughes had assigned a man from the RKO secret police force to keep tabs on Mitchum to make sure that he was obeying the rules of his probation and keeping up a clean image. He was basically a glorified chaperone. He went everywhere with Bob, keeping close tabs on his behavior and the company he kept. Dorothy was in heaven. This was the family life she had wanted all of these years. Mitchum had zero privacy during this period, even inside of his private home. Howard Hughes was in everyone's business. He was known to have spies everywhere and bugged phone lines, dressing rooms, and even homes. I'm not sure where his babysitter was for this, but while filming My Forbidden Past with Ava Gardner in late 1949, Bob and Ava began an intense sexual affair. And according to Mitchum, Ava wanted the two to run away together. He recounted that when she asked him to leave Dorothy for her, he told her she'd have to call and ask her if that's okay. So Ava allegedly did call Dorothy and said, "You've had him for 10 years, give somebody else a chance." Dorothy asked, "What did Bob say?" To which Ava replied, "He said to ask you." "Okay," said Dorothy. "The answer is no." I think every girl who ever worked with Bob Mitchum fell in love with him, Ava Gardner said later in life. Robert Mitchum wasn't willing to leave his wife. In fact, on March 3rd, 1952, the couple welcomed their third child into their family, a little girl named Patrine, or Trina. The boys, James and Christopher, were now 10 and 8 years old. Mitchum was a good father, when he was around to be. His children were used to going days or weeks without seeing their father, but when he was around, he showered them with attention. He would take his boys hunting, fishing, and camping. They'd swim in the pool together, play ball, all of those classic wholesome father-son activities. But just 1 year after the birth of their third child, Bob and Dorothy were separated again. She yearned for the husband and father she had when Bob was on probation and had to be a good husband and father. But he was now right back into his part-time bachelor life. Majority bachelor life, I should say. She was fed up. But she was married to a smooth talker, and he schmoozed his way back into Dottie's good graces every time she threatened to leave. Bob and Dorothy were invited to the Cannes Film Festival in 1954. Bob was thrown into near constant publicity events and photo shoots. On one shoot at the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea, a young British hopeful actress named Simone Silva jumped into the shot wearing a barely there pink scarf top, just covering her breasts, and a short white grass skirt. As numerous cameras snapped away, she dropped her top and rubbed her bare breasts all over a surprised Robert Mitchum, right in front of his wife. Bob then cupped her breasts with his hands to save her topless image from the cameras, and while trying to get the best shots possible of this saucy event, 3 cameramen fell off the cliff into the sea. Don't worry, they survived. These photos are readily available online if you want to check them out. This was yet another scandalous event for Robert Mitchum, only this time he didn't really do anything. It was done to him. Silva was looking for free publicity with a Hollywood star, and boy did she get it. Unfortunately, it didn't boost her career like she had hoped it would. And now Robert Mitchum had to do damage control, both at home and with the public. The topless girl in the Cannes photos tragically died just a few years later at the young age of 29 years old. Her cause of death was listed as stroke. And then another scandal erupted in 1957 with a super spicy article in the salacious tabloid magazine Confidential. The title of the article was Robert Mitchum, the Nude Who Came to Dinner. The multi-page spread detailed how Robert Mitchum and a young woman who was not his wife showed up to a masquerade party hosted by Charles Laughton and Paul Gregory, arriving late and completely wasted. According to the Scandal magazine, Mitchum then ripped off all his clothes, sat down at the dinner table with the other guests, and doused his naked body with ketchup. As shocked guests tried to peel their jaws off the table, Robert Mitchum said, "This is a masquerade party, isn't it? Well, I'm a hamburger." This was a Scandal magazine, and much of what they published was not true, including this story. Well, not entirely true. It was, however, not far off. The truth, if accounts are correct, is actually far worse. Friend and columnist James Bacon straightened the story out by saying what really happened. I'm going to quote him directly here, so prepare for some 1957 language. Grandma, if you're listening to this, please skip ahead 30 seconds. This is a bit inappropriate. Those of you listening around children, too. Bacon said, quote, "You know what that Mitchum Confidential story was? That was based on a story Mitchum told me, and he probably told a lot of other people. He said he was with Charles Laughton and this other guy, and of course the two of them are both fags, and they're eating dinner and, I don't know, they can't take their eyes off of Mitchum, I guess. So Mitchum said he opened his pants, took his cock out, laid it on the plate, and poured ketchup over it. And he said to them, 'Which one of you guys wants to eat this first?' Now that's the story he's telling. And I guess what happened is a reporter in Hollywood, one of them writing for Confidential on the quiet, anonymously wrote this story up, but it was too raunchy for the magazine, and the magazine changed it around to, 'I'm a hamburger,' or whatever it was, so they could publish it." End quote. Robert Mitchum was known for telling colorful stories, but he was also known for exhibiting colorful behavior. So who knows if this actually happened, but it was another blow to his marriage because Dottie was not happy about the story. Robert Mitchum sued Confidential magazine for $1 million, which was not done in those days. This made him a hero in Hollywood, standing up to malicious publications. Robert Mitchum turned out movie after movie for the next several years with RKO, and a few on loan out to other studios as well. He left RKO when his contract was up in the summer of 1954. His first film as a free agent was Not as a Stranger with Frank Sinatra, Olivia de Havilland, and Gloria Graham. Love them all. By the late 50s, although keeping very busy making movies, most of them were considered unremarkable. However, the best work of his career, according to him and an idea shared by many others, was The Night of the Hunter in 1955. The greatest commercial success of his film career came from the 1962 D-Day film The Longest Day, but he had just a supporting role in that movie. The Mitchums relocated to Maryland in May of 1959 and settled on a 280-acre estate on the Choptank River. Bob purchased a horse, and then another, until he had over 20 horses and began breeding and racing them. And then he got some cows. He loved his new tranquil life on the farm. The problem was he was still gone for weeks at a time on film shoots and party binges. So Dorothy was left in isolation with a bunch of horses and cows to take care of. A few years down the road, while Bob was away one time, Dorothy had it with life on the farm. She sold it. The Mitchums relocated back to California in 1966. Remember how Ava Gardner said every woman who worked with Robert Mitchum fell in love with him? Well, in 1962, that woman became Shirley MacLaine. And according to insiders, Mitchum loved her right back. It was more than the sexual flings he usually had with his co-stars. But still, he refused to leave his wife. He wasn't an awesome husband, not even a decent husband in my opinion, but he was devoted to his wife in his own way and refused to leave her behind. Still, Bob and Shirley continued their relationship for quite a while. After relocating to a home in Brentwood, California, one of their neighbors was Phyllis Diller. She recounted a story about how she threw a party, and at each table setting was a large goblet filled with water and a cute little goldfish. Part decoration, part party favor if her guests wanted to take it home. Robert Mitchum took a different route. Any guesses? Yes, that's right. He picked up the goblet at his place setting and chugged down the entire contents, goldfish and all. Diller went on to say how she would often advise Dorothy to divorce Bob. She said Dottie was such a kind, loving, and good person, and she deserved so much better. When Dorothy would find out about one of her husband's romps in the hay, he would plead with her that it was a case of temporary insanity. Phyllis Diller would tell Dorothy, "I think the correct word is horny." Mitchum once said, "Dottie sometimes says she hoped I would evolve, whatever that means. No way. People who've known me a long time tell her I was a bum when she married me, I'm a bum now, and I'll be a bum when I go." Robert Mitchum transitioned over to television in the 1980s to star in a few television miniseries, which were hot in the 80s. One of these was the Civil War miniseries North and South, which, as the daughter of a fierce Civil War buff, I was forced to watch on VHS more than once during cold and snowy Minnesota winters as a kid. Although today I would happily watch the series. There are some great names in it. If I had my dad's old VHS with 1988 TV commercials in it, that would be even better. Two other popular miniseries Mitchum did was The Winds of War and its sequel, War and Remembrance. All three of these, The Winds of War, North and South, and War and Remembrance, were nominated for tons of Primetime Emmys and took home several. None for Robert Mitchum, I'm sad to say. He did, however, receive the esteemed Cecil B. DeMille Award at the 1991 Golden Globe ceremony for outstanding contribution to the entertainment field. Robert Mitchum even hosted Saturday Night Live in November of 1987 when he was 70 years old. He says in his monologue, "Who knows what's going to happen tonight? All I know for sure is in 90 minutes, I go to a party." But unfortunately, he didn't make it to the SNL rap party. Dorothy whisked him away immediately after the show, not wanting a stumbling drunk husband on her hands. Robert Mitchum continued to appear in films and television into the 1990s, most notably in the psychological thriller hit Cape Fear. Good movie. Robert Mitchum had starred in the original version of Cape Fear in 1962 as the bad guy that went on to be played by Robert De Niro in the 90s version. Robert Mitchum's last Hollywood feature film was Dead Man in 1995. He was 78 years old. Pushing 80 years old now, Robert Mitchum's tough living lifestyle of late nights, free-flowing booze, and heavy smoking had begun to catch up with him. He suffered from emphysema, and then in the spring of 1997, he was diagnosed with late-stage lung cancer. Robert Mitchum, having lived the life of 50 ordinary men, passed away on July 1st, 1997, a little over a month before his 80th birthday. James Stewart died the very next day. Two of Hollywood's Golden Age legends gone within 24 hours of each other. Robert and Dorothy Mitchum had remained married through all of the ups and downs, and she was by his side when he drew his last breath as they slept in their bed. Dorothy lived for several more years. She died in 2014 at the age of 94. Per his request, there was no large memorial service for Robert Mitchum. Just a small service for his wife, his siblings, his children and grandchildren, and one dear friend, actress Jane Russell. Together, they scattered his ashes at sea. Now, I would like to share some other interesting things I learned during my research. Bullet point number 1. Robert Mitchum was the first male star to refuse having his chest shaved for a shirtless scene in the 1940s. Bullet point number 2. Robert Mitchum had a photographic memory. He could quickly read a script and have it locked in his memory and rarely felt the need to rehearse. Bullet point number 3. Robert Mitchum's marijuana arrest in the late 1940s didn't scare him away from smoking weed. He continued to smoke pot throughout his life. Again, he would love the freedom of it today. Bullet point number 4. President Dwight D. Eisenhower wasn't a fan of this love of getting high, so he prohibited the viewing of any Robert Mitchum films in the White House during his presidency, disgusted by the marijuana possession charge. Bullet point number 5. Robert Mitchum never finished high school. His former high school awarded him a diploma in 1975. I don't think it was the high school where he pooped in the hat. Bullet point number 6. All 3 of Robert Mitchum's children did some acting, along with a few of his grandchildren. In conclusion, Robert Mitchum was quite a wild character, wasn't he? And if you thought the few stories I shared today were crazy, I highly recommend picking up Lee Server's book because there are 100 more where that came from. Mitchum's early life would lead one to believe he was on a path to a life of nothing. Just making his way through life, bumming around and begging for food for the next several decades, never really making any real mark on the world. But man, did he shift into a pretty surprising life for a kid who left home to live the life of a starving homeless hobo. He slid right into the entertainment industry, and his natural, cool personality quickly earned him the title of one of Hollywood's most famous stars. Robert Mitchum wasn't a great husband. I really don't think many actors from Hollywood's golden age probably were. But he seemed extra bad. Dorothy sounded like such a wonderful woman, and she deserved better. Their children deserved better. But there was something about their love and connection that kept his heart, at least, faithful to his wife. He did truly love her, and I assume he knew he needed her. He needed that motherly support, because without it, he for sure would have died much younger. Dorothy was a stronger woman than I could ever be. Robert Mitchum had such a unique screen presence. Everyone who worked alongside him adored him. He was fun, funny, intelligent, just really down to earth. That was hard to find in Hollywood, and his co-stars really appreciated that about him. He floated through life the way he wanted to, and he didn't really care what anyone thought about it. Thank you, Robert Mitchum, for your cool presence on our screens. Thank you for showing us to live life the way we want to. I just think we should try and do it without hurting the people we love. I personally am not brave enough to live a Robert Mitchum style of life, nor do I want to, but I still envy you for doing so. Those of you out there who partake, take a couple hits in honor of Mr. Mitchum. And thank you all for listening. So let's talk about Patreon. I would love to share some great bonus content with you for a small monthly fee. I'm not going to throw a pity party, but it is a ton of work to turn out these shows every week. And eventually, I know I might get burned out of pretty much putting all my free time into work I'm providing for free. You know what I mean? Don't get me wrong, I am loving it, but eventually I'm sure it's going to get there. Just to give you an idea, I put in about 15 hours of research for each weekly episode, sometimes more. An hour or an hour and a half to record, and about 3 hours to edit each episode. I absolutely love learning about these stars and sharing their stories with you, but a person can only work for free for so long before it's going to lose its sparkle. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. It still sparkles. But I do have some great ideas for future products, and I won't be able to do that until I can free up some more time for them. So anyways, on Patreon, I have 2 tiers of support. For $4 a month, you can get into the Movie of the Month Club, and I'll send you a Stars of the Golden Age sticker and a shout out on a future episode. And for $8 a month, you get all of that, plus a full-length bonus episode about some really cool topics. I currently have bonus episodes about the history of the Hollywood sign, Black history in Hollywood, iconic Christmas movies, the history of the casting couch, old Hollywood studio rules, golden age nightclubs, and early sitcoms. I have some really cool topics planned for future episodes, so in exchange for supporting the show, I will make sure that you get some great content. So it's just something to consider. I don't think a ton of people realize how much work goes into producing a well-researched show. I know I didn't until I started this podcast. So thank you in advance for even considering it. And again, a huge thank you to Rachel L. for becoming a patron. So if you want to join Rachel and the others, go to patreon.com/Stars of the Golden Age podcast. And of course, please rate and review the show where you listen to your podcasts. It really helps new listeners discover the show. And give the show a follow on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks, guys, and thank you again to Stacy L. for this recommendation. Robert Mitchum has always been on my list, but I'm so happy you gave me the nudge to cover him, Stacy. Because holy crap, what a story. I hope I did it justice for you. My primary source for this episode was a book titled Robert Mitchum, Baby I Don't Care by Lee Server. I also used a book titled American Legends, The Life of Robert Mitchum by Charles River Editors, and IMDb.